Hi, I'm Walter Hood from Hood Design Studio out here in Oakland, California. It's a pleasure to be here today presenting ideas around the tidal basin. We have been here for about 20 years in practice, and I wanted to sort of say I started out in the Park Service in Washington, D.C., so this landscape holds a very particular set of memories for me. In particular, for us today, what we like to talk about is landscape as a medium. It's a medium of exchange between humans and the environment. And if you look at the tidal basin today, you can see that exchange has basically been overtaken by environment, and we've been subserviated to this. It's also a medium of exchange between ourselves and others, and how we present ourselves to the world and to one another. The basin actually can tell what we think a very powerful story. Our challenges, we think that we should be able to suggest a presence of multiple voices and interpretations here in this landscape, really thinking about the ecology and how we can give various variations of that experience. We want to have a multiplicity of perspectives from the design and its construction. We like to think about we can incorporate new ideas and new materials and technologies to an existing historic built landscape. And in turn, we'd like to then present a new aesthetic. Catherine talked a little about changing that aesthetic. What we'd like to look at is those opportunities within the infrastructure and within the connection between the classical and the baroque and the romantic, and how do we create this dynamic. And one way we thought about doing this was not through a single design, but maybe thinking about history and culture. And the Ghanaian Akan symbol of the Sankofo expresses it is not taboo to fetch what is at risk of being left behind. So how do you tell those stories about the past and bring them forward? So we have three basic things we'd like to talk about today. One is developing a prophetic aesthetic, and that is really telling the truth about a place in which you are sort of existing in. So these monuments are basically these edifices that are basically being held up, and they're being maintained over time. Secondly, we'd like to embrace the flux. Catherine talked a lot about over the next century, what we're going to see is waters are going to rise. And how do we embrace that flux in our lives? And how do we let that water be free when it needs to be free? And then really thinking about the inventions that have been in place for the last 100 years, when we really think about the pumping and the walls and all of the things that are holding this landscape at bay, what are those new technologies that we can bring in? And so this is our Gestalt diagram that we've had since midterm. So I think someone has their microphone on. And you can sort of see what we've laid out is the tidal basin. We've tried to create a new landscape around it, and we're calling it a hush harbor. And a hush harbor is an American landscape. And it comes out of the southern landscape, particularly that of slavery and of the Aboriginals who would take refuge into these places, the great dismal swamps. We're finding out now that people actually lived in swamps and were able to sort of maintain themselves. But this idea of can we look at a wetland in a very different way? And can we look to the monuments to begin to tell us how we might begin to think of these things? We have Lincoln at two ends, and we have Jefferson, and in the middle we have MLK, which is intentional to tell this narrative about the history of the country. And then we have FDR over to the side. And FDR, if we think about it, during the time in the last century, where we have this powerful way of thinking about infrastructure through the New Deal. So maybe telling this new narrative through a landscape story might allow us to invent and think about the world differently. Next. We'd like to do this project by looking at some of the historic things that have happened here, from the planting of the cherries to just the layout of the infrastructure around the tidal basin itself, to some of the landscapes that I hadn't really understood played a really big part and people living here in this landscape. Theodore Roosevelt Island, this was a place where we found in summers, the president and others would take respite here, but it's also a place where the colored soldiers or the Black soldiers had to take refuge during the Civil War. And then being able to bring these narratives back to bay in this landscape that's fraught, right, with change over time. And what we'd like to suggest is maybe we can speculate. So we're not going to present a single design to you today, but we want to speculate. And as Catherine talked about the edges, we speculate that there will be a levee around the entire tidal basin, and we'd like to use the Independence Edge as a way to sort of create this new levee. And this, along with floodgates, would allow us to kind of think about this landscape anew. And so raising this edge and coming back to the 100-year event allows us then to think differently about how we might redesign and tell different stories about this landscape. I'm going to share with you 4 different speculative stories today, and one talks about a walk, a tidal basin walk, another a hush harbor, another will talk a little bit about the cherry orchard, and lastly about the flood. And we're going to do this through 4 different novellas. These are fictions, they're purely speculative, and they really try to tie these elements that I talked about earlier together as we experience them. So the first one is the school field trip. This is a class from Williamsburg, Virginia. They come over and they're really keen on seeing this new invention that has been built in the tidal basin. It's a pure 360-degree elevated levitated circle. The circle basically provides access to all of the different monuments through a wetland experience. As the kids arrive to the east side, they get in line and their teacher takes them out and they head off in 2 different directions. One group heads on a walkway and a canopy and they head towards the Jefferson Memorial, and another group heads towards the MLK Memorial. They decide that they will meet at FDR. And as they make their way along the walk, the students then begin to experience a landscape in a completely different way. The group that heads towards the Jefferson Memorial is able then to immerse themselves in this new wetland experience. They're in a structure that's actually providing shade, but it's also providing access through a marsh landscape. As they get to the Jefferson Memorial, they sit on the steps and they look back and they can see this new wetland experience engulfing the MLK Memorial, as well as allowing the teacher to tell the story of Jefferson and his relationship to Lincoln and then later to King. The group that heads towards MLK, they descend from this overhead structure down into this wetland landscape. Now King's monument is engulfed in this tidal marsh. They look up at King, and as they're reading the description, someone notes that in a lot of his writings, he talks about water. They see the lapping edge of the monument. The kids go down to the edge, and they're able then to look at the interpretive signs of the different types of plantings that have now become part of that landscape experience of the monument of the MLK Memorial. The next novella, The Hush Harbors. It's a family reunion is happening in the city. And they decide this year that they would like to take an African-American tour around Washington, D.C. One of the family members remember reading in the newspaper that there's a new tour, one that starts at Arlington Cemetery and takes them forth to Teddy Roosevelt Island, then to Georgetown at the AME Church, then to the new National Museum of African American History, and then to the Hush Harbor. And they ask themselves, what's a hush harbor? And as they start thinking about how all of these pieces are connected, it's really a story about how Washington, D.C. was built. So they head over to Arlington Cemetery and they go to section 27. And this is where the African American soldiers are buried. They also read about the Freedmen's Village, that the Arlington Cemetery is one of the first landscapes where free slaves were actually housed for up to 30 years. They then head over to Roosevelt Island. They get on a bike, get on a trail and head over. And they learn about the Civil War and the African American free slaves who actually fought there and who were stationed there. From there, they head to Georgetown and they see one of the oldest AME churches in the country. And then from there, they head over to the museum. Once they arrive, they get into an Uber and then head over to the MLK Memorial. Once there, they're immediately impressed by the changing monument. The last time that they were there, the water was flooded, but now they see new wetlands, they see birds, and they get in line and they take a photo in front of the monument. And as they read the inscriptions, they decide then to go off on a walk. And the walk is pointing towards the Jefferson Memorial, and it suggests that this is the Hush Harbor. They first get to the Cat's Bridge, and they read inscriptions on the bridge that talk about the Native Indians that were once here in the Potomac, the various groups. As they walk across this floating, again, a floating wetland dock, they actually come into association with various pedagogical displays. The first pedagogical display talks about how this was once a beach and how it was segregated. And to integrate it, they decided not to have a beach. They then walk a little longer and they notice the definition of a hush harbor, and they see paintings of landscapes in which free slaves are actually practicing religion. Along the bottom of the deck is written Hush Harbor. As you walk towards the Jefferson Memorial, more interpretive displays are talking about the ecology of the area and what the area once looked like. Once they arrive at the Jefferson Memorial, they're able to sit again and look back across the landscape at the walk in which they just walked through and contemplate this idea of a hush harbor. As they continue their walk towards the FDR Memorial, they notice these large gates, and they read underneath them, and they see that these new gates are actually holding back the Potomac. They also are looking back across to Arlington where they started, and they begin to see the sort of connection between the diaspora that they began from that morning. The next novella is called The Flood. It's a necklace of monuments. Here, the National Park Service, they're really excited about today. This is the day in which they take their first tour to show the new improvements at the tidal basin. No one thought that they could do it, but they basically freed the waters. They cut off FDR, made it an island, built a wall and new plantings along its edge, moved MLK upward, and isolated Jefferson and removed the freeway. Here they allowed the Potomac to flow in. And so now, almost like an arpeggio moving around, there's a new floating wetland, and this floating wetland absorbs the tidal surges as they come in. But they also isolate each one of the monuments. Here, the National Park Service is really excited by how they're leading the tours, because all tours now will be by boat. So you will go to the east side by the Smithsonian, and you would come down into a set of docks and piers. And each tour is led by a boat that would take you over to a monument. It's a very different way of seeing this landscape. They're really excited. The first stop in the boat tour is MLK Memorial. It's now a small peninsula on the basin that has been surged. They get there and they're able then to talk about how this landscape is protected and actually how it actually performs. And through this sort of almost as a sponge, the landscape is able to react to the rise in water. Second stop, the Jefferson Memorial, a floating island. As the National Park Service Ranger is leading the tour, he begins to suggest that the docks are not only just docks, but they're actually tied to the wetlands, that these wetlands are actually floating, and the Jefferson Memorial will actually need to get surged over time. As they stand in the Jefferson and look around, they see this 360-degree view of a landscape that's in constant flux and in constant change. Some of the kids run down to the edge and begin to sort of look at the various plantings, and one of them comments that this looks like a coral reef, and the National Park Service guy smiles. And the last view coming, and the last stop is to FDR. Now FDR is right at the edge. There's a small wall right at the edge that protects it at this point. This new structure, this new set of wetlands creates a new forecourt for it. The Park Service guides talks about how over time they removed the floodgates and how they used a lot of the dredging to help surge some of the islands and create some of the new wetlands. They take the boat back out and back to the dock. Looking back, one of them says, "Wow, the memorial looks great in this light. The reflection in the water is mesmerizing." Now, and the last is the cherry orchard. It's a February day, late February, and it's been unseasonably warm. The cherries have blossomed. People are caught off guard. 3 families who are visiting in the area decide that they would go out and see the cherry blossoms. The cherry blossoms now have been moved. They've been moved behind the new surge landscape, behind the FDR Memorial that used to be ball fields, and they take up Independence Drive. The south lane has been vacated and they've been raised up and they sit high. As you come down Independence Drive, the new monuments can be seen through them, and you can actually sit underneath the new cherries and look back across the Potomac. The three families descend in three different ways. The Lee family decides to take the new bosque that's on the Kuntz Bridge, that's on the southern lane of Independence. As they're walking through, they can see the new wetlands underneath in this barren landscape. It almost seems surreal, but in this new fabricated landscape, it seems okay. The Martinez family makes their way from the southern edge and they walk up against the mall. And when they look back across, all they see are just these amazing cherry blossoms falling on the ground. Joe and Mary were in town visiting their daughter, and they decide to take a long walk from the north-hand side and ended up along the Potomac. They look out across the Potomac and they look at one another and smile. Thank you.